Like we noted last week, if you read the Christmas story carefully and you agree with what Luke is saying in that story, and you apply it to principles related to governance, what you end up with is a system where everyone has a voice. Yeah, that's what you end up with. But that didn't just happen, right? It happened over time with a lot of development in between. In the case of the development of democracy, we're going to talk about that today. And we're going to talk about some of the seminal events in American history. But it's important to remember that whenever a group of people are moving in a certain direction, they're doing so because of values that have already been adopted and that are driving them in that direction. Okay? So it's not like, democracy seems, according to my ability to understand different forms of government, seems like it's the best choice. Therefore, I'm going to choose that because many nations have not even yet, to this day, chosen that as a form of governing themselves. So it's really a matter of how your values drive where you're going. Okay, so, and we can see that specifically in the way it develops in the West, but more particularly, I use America as an example because I figured you're all more familiar with American history than you are with European history. Okay, so aside from the Pilgrims, who were a Protestant group in England, what was going on in England during the Reformation is that there were partisans of Roman Catholicism, and there were Protestants, mostly Calvinists. Okay? And it created major conflict. In fact, there was an English civil war over it. And for a while, a guy named Oliver Cromwell ruled instead of a king or a queen, as was the case in Queen Elizabeth I and II. Aside from that, those people came here for purposes of religious freedom and to establish the kind of society that they thought was based on biblical principles. Okay, so that was the King of England, I don't know who it was at the time, gave them a charter to come to the New World and to establish a community. Okay. Now, the Pilgrims weren't the first to come here. There was, prior to the 1600s, a group that came to Virginia, to Tidewater, Virginia. Tidewater's along the coast. Tidewater, Virginia had a community, what was the name of that community?
Jamestown?
Jamestown, thank you. Jamestown was established there. They ultimately failed. They couldn't deal with the weather, they couldn't deal with the native population. For various factors, the settlement failed. Okay, but you can visit it to this day, if you wish. It's close to Yorktown, where the British surrendered to George Washington. Okay, so, but aside from that, North America was populated initially by investors, or investors put money into projects that they thought would make them a lot of money. Okay, and those projects were, okay, because there was a lot of land, and because there was different kinds of climates where you could grow things that you can't grow in England, they would invest in projects in North America. Okay, initially those were in Virginia. And the crop that they were investing in was what? Tobacco. Exactly, tobacco. They thought tobacco would make them a lot of money because tobacco was popular in Europe. Okay. Over time, as they moved further south, the climate gets even milder, and what is the crop that became the primary driver further south?
Cotton.
Cotton, exactly, cotton, okay? However, they had a problem, especially with cotton, but with tobacco as well. You've got to harvest it. And with cotton, you have to separate, I guess, the seeds from the cotton itself. So they needed labor, okay? And that's how slavery got to America. They needed labor for those investments to make money, all right? Now, the people who were involved in the slave trade were primarily the Portuguese and the Spanish. The British eliminated the slave trade. It was a guy named Wilberforce. Have you heard of him? No? Wilberforce was a member of Parliament, a very pious Christian, and he believed that slavery was a violation of everything Christians believed in. You cannot own another human being when human beings are all created in the image of God. And Wilberforce was very familiar with the Gospels. In the Gospels, Jesus associates with those who are considered the riffraff of society. Okay, he's with the tax collectors and the sinners and the sick and the crippled and the blind and the people who are forgotten. So Wilberforce knew full well that this idea that you could own another human being and force them to do work for you in order to make your enterprise profitable, he knew full well that this was a crime against humanity and God. So he fought against the slave trade in Parliament, and he eventually got it banned, okay? And he sacrificed his career for it. That was the end of his career. But he believed in it very deeply, and so that's what happened, okay? But by the time Wilberforce had banned slavery in Britain, it was already well established in America. Okay, and many of these farms were no longer business enterprises from Europe because we had won our independence. They were now independently owned by wealthy plantation owners, okay? And wealthy plantation owners, in order to maintain their lifestyle, has anybody here ever visited a plantation in the South? Have you? Yeah. Beautiful big homes. The drive up to the home oftentimes is lined by beautiful trees, and everything is perfectly in order. And cotton made them boatloads of money, because at the same time what was developing was industry in Britain in particular, where the demand for cotton was enormous. The industry of creating clothing out of cotton. I forget what you call those factories, but there's a certain name for it. Textile mills, yeah, okay.
Did you say?
Textile mill.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what they were called. So, if cotton, so if something were to interrupt, oh, and by the way, textile mills were developing in New England as well, not just in Britain, but also in this country up north. If the flow of cotton was interrupted in some way, not only would the rich get poorer, but many people would be out of a job. All right? So there was a lot of pressure on the planters to produce as much cotton as possible. And at one point in our history, 60% of our exports were cotton. Over 50% was cotton. Yeah. So it was a big industry. Okay, so they needed slave labor in order to make this profitable. And where did the slave labor come from? Well, like I say, there were various groups involved in the slave trade. The Portuguese were famous for it, but I think Spaniards were involved in it as well. The British had stopped. And what they would do is they would make deals. You see, they would go to Africa. The idea wasn't that they'd go out into the bush and start forcing people onto slave ships. That's not the way it worked. The way it worked is that they would take advantage of tribes in Africa that were in conflict with each other. Okay? And these various tribes would abduct people from enemy tribes and sell them into slavery. And also the kings of these African entities, I don't know if you could call them countries or not, but the kings of these African entities were also involved because could make a lot of money on it, okay? So if a slave ship showed up at a certain place, and there is a place in Africa you can go to now, which is where they actually picked up the slaves. They've preserved it. The slaves would be sold to the slave traders, and they would put them on ships, and they would bring them to North America, where they would be put to work in the cotton fields or in the tobacco fields. If you went further south, I remember Union soldiers used to be just amazed at what they saw when they came into the port of New Orleans and up the Mississippi River. It was just amazing. There were groves of orange trees, cotton, and sugar cane. And along the South Carolina coast on the Sea Islands, they grew rice. So there were a lot of different crops involved that required this slave labor, okay? So these southern planters became dependent on slave labor to stay in business and to continue to produce as much produce as they did. At the time when the colonies decided that they were going to become independent, okay, you probably all know that story. Each colony sent representatives to Philadelphia, and they debated independence and so forth. And eventually, they decided that it was the right thing to do, based on the idea that the British Crown was abusing people in their own colonies. Okay, taxation was one thing, but it was more than taxation. There were other abuses as well. One of the abuses, okay, now, at the time when independence was, when they decided to declare independence, they needed someone to write down a justification for why the colonies ought to be independent from the mother country. And so a committee was formed by Congress, the Continental Congress it was called. And on that committee was Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Okay? And they were told to write up a declaration justifying independence for the colonies. All right? So now the question becomes, these three get together, and the question is, who's going to write this thing? And both Franklin and Adams claimed they weren't good writers, but Jefferson was, so he got the job. All right? Thomas Jefferson otherwise was kind of a shy guy. He didn't say much when the meetings took place. He didn't say much of anything. But he did write the Declaration of Independence. And of course, the famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence is what?
People are created equal.
Yeah, yeah. All men are created equal. Now, it's important to understand that the English language is doesn't have a neuter pronoun. It's either male or female. Okay, so the male pronoun is used for humanity. At least it used to be. People are trying to get around that now, but it used to be. Okay. when people said all men are created equal, people assumed that included women too. All right. Hebrew, on the other hand, has a pronoun, has different kinds of pronouns. So it depends on which language you're dealing with. But English, that's the way it is for English. Okay. So all men are created equal, but then he goes on to say, and have certain inalienable rights. Inalienable meaning that they come from their Creator. Okay? They're not rights that can be taken away. So what that means is that government doesn't confer the rights. Government protects the rights. Okay? So, take the Bill of Rights, for example. Before the Constitution could be adopted by all of the colonies, the Bill of Rights needed to be included, or they would not accept it. Another aspect of American government that grew out of that was the Senate of the United States. Because there were big states and there were small states, the small states were concerned that the big states would have too much power. So in the upper chamber, which was the Senate, every state was represented equally with 2 senators. Whether you're North Dakota with a population below 1 million or California with a population of 40 million, you still have 2 senators. Okay? You get more representatives depending on population, but not senators. All right? And a lot of people don't understand that is the reason that we have an electoral college as well. The electoral college gives more representation to smaller states so that when a president is elected, it's possible for a president who got fewer of the popular votes to actually be elected because they're elected on the basis of the states. Remember, the country is called the United States, okay? And each state has a certain level of sovereignty, okay? So, and you know, that's what the Supreme Court decided vis-a-vis abortion. Many people thought they were making abortion illegal. They were not. What they were doing was returning it back to the states. Okay? So now you can have abortion in one state, you can have restrictions on abortion in another state, and you can have outright no abortion in another state. It just depends on what the state decides. Okay? So, yeah, states and states' rights comes into the ultimate conflict when it comes to defining what Jefferson meant when he said all men are created equal. All right. So, when it came time to ratify the Constitution, they had a problem. Jefferson had put in the original draft of the Declaration that one of the abuses of the British government was imposing slavery on the colonies. All right? The southern states objected for obvious reasons. Okay? So they took it out. Okay, but originally that was in there. And so once they took that out, and it was clear that every state would have equal representation in the Senate, and that there was a certain set of rights that the government could not, that the legislature could not by law infringe: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so forth, that it could not infringe. And by the way, this idea of having rights that are given to us by God is not only a biblical idea in a sense, but it was also the idea of the framers that you could have a tyranny even in a democracy. And they called it the tyranny of the majority. Okay, so that if the majority decided on a particular law, for example, that infringed the right of free speech, that could be taken away. Okay, so they wanted to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority. Okay, so that was also part of the reason for the Bill of Rights. All right. Okay, so when it comes time to pass the Constitution, of course, the slave states insist that slavery must remain legal, despite what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence. Okay, nevertheless, okay, so when you hear, and sometimes people argue this point, they argue the idea that people came up with theories of how people from other races are inferior, and therefore slavery is actually not just okay, it's a positive good for the people who are enslaved, because they live a better life that way. Okay, that was their theory. Okay, but that's not the way it developed. The way it developed was they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. And then they came up with arguments as to why it was okay, all right, as justifications. In order to protect it, the southern states, the southern states threatened not to sign the Constitution unless slavery was made legal constitutionally, that it could not be taken away by the states that had done away with it. Now, why did the northern states do away with it? Well, there's a number of reasons for it. For example, if you take the state of Pennsylvania, it was largely the Quakers who decided slavery was anti-Christian. So they did away with it very early on. And New England at this time was still very much a church-involved population. In fact, pretty much everybody was involved in church in those days. Okay, so same thing. Okay, that's where abolitionism developed, was up in New England. And So the northern states do away with it very early on, partly because of their Christian faith, and partly because the economy in the north is developing differently. The economy in the north is not developing an agricultural economy like the south is. The south is entirely agricultural, which is why there were very few cities in the south. You had Charleston on the coast because that was a port. You had New Orleans, which was the largest city, because that was a port. You had Atlanta, which was basically, along with Richmond, the only two cities in the South that produced anything, and that at a very low rate. Okay, they had some foundries and other things that produced things. But most of the production took place up north, where industrialization was taking place. Okay? So you had two economic systems developing in antebellum America. One an agricultural society based on slave labor, and the other a more of an industrial economy, which was based on free labor. Okay, in other words, you hired somebody and paid them a wage to work for you in your factory or in your shop or in whatever it was you had. All right, so you've got two different kinds of economies developing in the North and the South. But this idea that all people are created equal, while it was not applied equally in the agricultural South during the antebellum period. Antebellum simply means before the Civil War. During the antebellum period, it was not applied equally. But it was in the North. Okay? So, for example, in the North, you could easily free a slave. All right, when Grant married his wife Julia, she came from a plantation, believe it or not, and her father owned a lot of slaves, and he gave Grant one of his slaves to help him earn a living. But Grant couldn't stand the idea of it. He hated the idea of it. So he just went down to the local government office and he set him free. The guy in the local office said, "Are you sure you want to do this? You can get up to $10,000 because this is a young slave and he's good for many years of labor." Grant said, "I don't care. Free him." So he freed him and let him go. So there were a lot of free blacks up in the North. Okay? And when the Underground Railroad developed, as you know, once they got out of the South and into Pennsylvania, they were free. Okay?
The Underground Railroad was just near where I grew up, back in Pennsylvania.
Is that right?
And the houses, number of the houses are still there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it was quite an operation, and of course there was one woman in particular who was referred to as Moses. You remember who that was? Harriet Tubman, yeah. She not only freed herself, she came back on pain of getting caught by these, they used these hounds to find them. Freed her family, came back, freed other slaves, came back, freed other slaves. So there were a lot of free slaves in the North, and then something terrible happened. Okay, something that is a day that I hate to use the phrase FDR used about Pearl Harbor, but it is a day that lives in infamy. All right. A young black guy got over the border into Pennsylvania, and even though he was with his so-called owner, he claimed that because he was on free soil, he was now a free man. All right? And the owner took umbrance with that, and they ended up in court. And that case ended up in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court judge at the time was a Southerner, all right? Tawney, I believe his name was. He decided, and it's called the Runaway Slave Act, I think it's called, or something like that. Yeah. He decided that it was legal for Southerners to cross over into free territory and re-abduct freed slaves. Yeah. So we're starting to see the development of a conflict that is irresolvable. All right, it's absolutely irresolvable. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Lincoln, because there's a lot of misconceptions about Lincoln. Lincoln grew up in Kentucky, which was a slave state. But he hated slavery his entire life. All right? Now, some people have argued that Lincoln's intent with respect to the Civil War was not to free the slaves. Lincoln's intent was to preserve the Union. Okay? The real answer to that question is yes, but that's a distinction without a difference. Because you could not possibly reunite the North and the South without freeing the slaves. It wasn't possible. Not only that, but Lincoln himself dedicated himself to the freeing of the slaves. All right? He didn't know exactly how to handle all these freed slaves who did nothing but work in the fields all their lives. That was going to be part of what was called Reconstruction after the Civil War. But he didn't live to do it, as you all know. He was assassinated, which was a real disaster, not only for the people of the North, but for the people of the South as well, and for the whole country. But he said many different things during the Civil War that have led people to argue that his main purpose was to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. Okay? And I'm going into all of this because it all relates back to Luke's preference for the underprivileged. And the stories in Luke, next week we're going to get into the issue of women. The issue of how Luke presents Jesus' preference for helping the underprivileged, for whatever reason they were underprivileged, whether they were poor or sick or lepers or even tax collectors, okay? Heaven forbid, that's for sure. So anyway, here's the situation at the opening of the Civil War. You've got the deep southern states have seceded from the Union. That is South Carolina first, then Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Texas. Those are the states of the Deep South. Then, when South Carolina bombs federal property in the Charleston Harbor, and Lincoln calls up 75,000 volunteers to defend federal property, that's when the other southern states secede. Okay? That would be Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia. And all of those states had people who wanted to stay in the Union. Okay? So there were Union sympathizers in those states. And then you had the border states, okay, that never seceded, but they were slave states. Those were, what? There were 4 of them. Maryland, which surrounded the federal capital, okay?
West Virginia.
Okay, West Virginia broke away later on. Okay, so at the time it was still Virginia.
Ohio.
Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. Those border states had not yet seceded. And Lincoln believed that if they seceded from the Union, the war would be lost. The country would be finished. All right? Now bear in mind, the reason this war starts in the first place is because Lincoln is duly elected as the President of the United States by the Electoral College. Now, he didn't get 1 vote in the southern states, not even 1. But because the population in the north was much higher, being an industrial area rather than an agricultural area, he still won the Electoral College. Okay? So here you've got the duly elected President of the United States, and you've got states saying that, well, because he was elected, we're out. We're done. We're finished. Because his aim is to get rid of slavery. That's what he's out for. All right? They were right. But what they were doing was illegal. Okay? Because there's nothing in the Constitution about states being allowed to secede from the Union. Remember, the Constitution starts by saying, we, the people of what? The United States. That's right. There's nothing in there about seceding from the Union. Nothing whatsoever. Okay? So, at this time, it was the Republican Party that was the far left party, and it was the Democratic Party that was the far right party. Okay? It's interesting how things change. All right? The Republican Party considered this treason. All right? And treason can't be tolerated. When somebody commits treason, they're punished. All right? So, of course, the war starts. All right. You know how many casualties there were to this war? 1 million. 1 million. the battles, it wasn't just that the weaponry became more sophisticated and so could kill more people. That was part of it. But the tactics of fighting war had not caught up. People were still following what Napoleon used to do way back right after the French Revolution. All right? And you couldn't do you couldn't use the tactics Napoleon used with the sophisticated armaments that existed at the time without having huge numbers of casualties. Gettysburg alone, 50,000 people. Antietam, the bloodiest day, 23,000. And on and on and on it goes. Okay. So, early in the war, when the Union generals were incompetent, they couldn't deal with most of the generals were West Point graduates. Some went south, some went north. The best ones went south, okay? And and so as a result, the Southern Army was winning all the battles. In the summer of 1862, Lincoln writes the Emancipation Proclamation, where he says, starting January 1st, 1863, all slaves that exist in states that are now in rebellion will be forever free. Okay? So his Secretary of State, which was a guy named William Seward, and a really smart guy, says to Lincoln, Lincoln, don't issue this to the public yet. You have got to wait until your army has a victory before you can issue this proclamation. Because they're at the point now where both Britain and France are ready to recognize the Confederacy as a separate nation. And if that happened, the United States would be cut in half for good. That would be the end of it. All right, so Lincoln needs to avoid that. And he needs a victory. All right? So on September 17th, 1862, Lee decides to invade the North. Now he thinks Maryland, people living in Maryland are going to rush to his side because Maryland was a slave state. But here's what he didn't know about Maryland. Okay, Maryland is divided into two sections. There's the part of Maryland that is on the eastern side of the Chesapeake Bay, and then there's the rest of Maryland. All right? The eastern side of the Chesapeake Bay is flat, it's got fertile soil, and its climate is milder because it's right next to the ocean. Western Maryland was a carbon copy of the North. Small farmers, small hamlets, small towns. All the people in Western Maryland remained loyal to the United States. Okay? Who's the famous black agitator during this period?
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass came from the eastern shore of Maryland. Yeah, okay. All right, so Lee decides he's going to invade Maryland, and if he can get a victory on northern soil, because western Maryland was over the border of Virginia, and it was kind of a border state, even though he thought they would welcome him, they didn't. They insulted his soldiers and waved the Stars and Stripes and everything else. So he invades. Lincoln has a totally incompetent general, but he is good at one thing. He's good at organizing an army, getting it fed, getting it clothed, getting it drilled, getting it trained, getting it ready to do battle. What he's not good at is battle, which is what they're for, okay? All right? But in any case, he meets Lee at a little creek called Antietam, near a little town called Sharpsburg, which is still there, same houses, same town you would have seen in 1862. It's a real fun place to visit. You get to Antietam Creek, there the two armies meet on the bloodiest day in America. Well, the battle is a draw in the sense that nobody actually wins the battle. But what it does do is force Lee back into Virginia. Okay? His days of invading the North are over. All right? Lincoln considers that a victory. He initiates the Emancipation Proclamation. And now, Britain and France will never, ever recognize the South as an independent nation because they will not recognize a country that still has slavery. All right, so Lincoln has dodged a bullet big time here. All right, so he at the time, the proclamation is somewhat, the North is starting to get used to the idea that the war can't be won without freeing the slaves. They're starting to get used to that idea. Of course, the abolitionists, New England in particular, parts of Pennsylvania and New York, are very happy with the emancipation. They want the slaves freed. Okay, so what happens is that now, if the slaves in rebellion don't put down their arms and surrender, their slaves are free. And they start to leave the plantations, okay, in droves. And they follow Union armies all over the place. And the armies don't know how to take care of them. So a big organization is established in the North, the Freedmen's Association, I think it's called. And they, as is often the case in America, nonprofits fit in where government is not doing the job, all right? And on top of that, Antietam creates another very famous person, all right? Taking care of wounded soldiers is a very rudimentary science at this point in time. If you're hit with one of these bullets, they were created to flatten out when they hit you. And what they would do is when they hit your bone, they'd shatter it. Okay? So if you got hit in the shoulder, your shoulder was shattered. It was gone. It was the end of it. If you were hit in the knee, it was gone. If you were hit in the, in the foot, it was gone because the bone would be shattered. Okay? Surgeons at that time didn't know how to deal with this stuff. So now women start to get involved. Prior to this time, in antebellum America, women were to be seen but not heard. Okay, so the Civil War not only initiates freedom for the slaves, it initiates the feminist movement that will eventually lead to suffrage for women. All right? And the most famous woman who came to Antietam in the aftermath of the battle to take care of the soldiers, actually during the battle, she's from New England, and she's very famous. Does anybody know who she was? No?
Or Claire Martin.
Clara Barton. Clara Barton, founder of the Red Cross. Yeah, Clara Barton. Clara Barton came and she, together with others, created a large organization that made hospitals. They figured out how to deal with, most of what was killing wounded soldiers was infection. She found some substance, I don't know what it was, because they didn't have disinfectants, that would help kill the bacteria. She got the soldiers pain medication. She was a bona fide American hero as much as anyone was. Okay, Clara Barton. All right. Now, let me finish this up by telling you why I told this story. The reason I told this story is because throughout the whole war, again and again and again, and it's in the Gettysburg Address as well, and it's in virtually every speech Lincoln gave, almost, is one phrase. One phrase. He doesn't take it from the Constitution. In fact, he has the 13th Amendment of the Constitution passed before the war is over. The 13th Amendment is what bans involuntary servitude. No more slavery. Okay, in the northern states, along with a couple of southern states that he got the support of, Tennessee and Louisiana in particular, passed the amendment. Okay, so the 13th Amendment is passed before Lee finally surrenders, and involuntary servitude or slavery is done. It's now a part of the Constitution. If you've ever watched the movie by, what's his name? The famous movie maker. He made E.T. and Spielberg. If you've ever seen Spielberg's movie, that's what it's about. It's about Lincoln getting that amendment passed before the war is over. Okay, he's like 13 votes short. He tells his cabinet, they're all complaining. Right? They're all complaining. He bangs on the table. Get me 13 votes! They all shut up and went out and got the 13 votes. But what he quotes again and again and again and again is not the Constitution. It's all men are created equal. All men are created equal. Government for the people, by the people, and of the people will not perish from the earth. That's his whole thing. Lincoln was not a religious person. He didn't go to church. He very seldom mentioned the name of Jesus. But in his second inaugural address, he said, you know, both sides prayed to the same God. They both asked for that God's aid in helping them win the war against the other one. But God had God's own purposes. And we don't know what those purposes were. It's too far beyond our ability to understand. He did say, if every drop of blood that was drawn by the lash, meaning the whip, had to correspondingly be drawn by the sword, then it must be said, as it was 3,000 years ago, that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. That's his famous, one of his famous lines from his second inaugural but his most famous line is, with charity for all, and with charity for all and malice toward none, let us get about the business of rebuilding the nation, binding up its wounds, caring for the widow and the orphan, yada, yada, yada. And when Grant asked Lincoln, what are the terms of surrender, Lincoln said, tell the Southern soldiers there's been enough bloodshed, send them home, and tell them to farm their farms and obey the laws. We're not going to take revenge. Okay? So while Lincoln may not have been a Christian in confession, certainly his actions more reflected Christianity than that of any of his generals and many of his soldiers. That all men are created equal. That is a biblical, and it is emphasized more than any other author by Luke. Okay? Next week, we're going to get into what this means vis-a-vis how people treat women and women's roles vis-a-vis men in society. Okay? Because Jesus radically transforms what that is. Okay, so next week we're going to look at a bunch of verses in Luke about how he treats women and what it all means. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.